The declaration arrived not as a message but as a spectacle, and that was the first mistake the Vrahel ascendancy ever made about humanity. They did not simply transmit their intent. They staged it. Across 900 worlds of the Concordance, on every relay screen and public forum and diplomatic channel that could carry a signal, the Vrahel High Reader stood in a chamber carved from a single tooth of some long-dead Leviathan and read the words of war aloud. His voice was a slow tectonic thing, translated into 400 languages simultaneously, and it was designed to be remembered. That was the point. The Vrahel did not want a war that the galaxy would forget. They wanted a lesson. To the species that calls itself human, the High Reader intoned, and the Leviathan bone chamber amplified his voice until it seemed to come from the walls of the universe itself. You have spread. You have grown loud. You have taken orbit around stars that were promised to the ascendancy before your sun had cooled. We have watched you for 100 of your years, and we have measured you, and we find you wanting. You build fast. You build clever, but you have never been tested. You have never bled against a real fire. Today the ascendancy ends your ignorance. We declare a war of correction. We will not conquer you. We will unbuild you until the galaxy remembers what you were before you forgot your place. It was, everyone agreed later, a magnificent piece of theater. The Vrahel had ruled the outer arm of the Concordance for 11,000 years by exactly this method, by making examples so total, so unhurried, so certain, that no species dared test the reality behind the performance. They had unbuilt the Thesson. They had unbuilt the Koru that were. When the Vrahel declared a war of correction, other species did not fight it. They negotiated the terms of their own diminishment and were grateful for the mercy. And so, when the human ambassador to the Concordance was summoned to give humanity's reply, the entire galaxy leaned in to watch a small, young species learn its place with appropriate terror. The ambassador was a woman named Idris Van, and she was not young, but she carried humanity's answer, and humanity's answer had been written by people who were. She stood before the assembled delegates of 90 species in the Hall of Long Accounts. She did not have a Leviathan bone chamber. She had a plain podium and a plain suit and a face that had gone very still. She let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, and then a little longer until it was frightening. The ascendancy has declared a war of correction, she said. Her voice did not boom. It did not need to. Every delegate in the hall had leaned so far forward to hear it that a whisper would have carried. Humanity has read the declaration carefully. We understand the terms. We understand that you intend to make an example of us, so that the galaxy will remember. She paused. We accept. A ripple went through the hall, not of words, but of 100 species shifting in alarm, because acceptance was not a thing anyone said to the Vrahel. You did not accept a war of correction. You survived it diminished, or you did not survive it at all. We accept, Ambassador Van said again, on the condition that you understand what you have asked for. You said we have never been tested. You said we have never bled against a real fire. You are correct. We have spent 100 years in the Concordance being polite, being small, being grateful for a seat at your table. You looked at our politeness and you decided it was weakness. That was your measurement. I am here to tell you that your measurement was wrong. She looked for a moment directly into the Vrahel delegation's optical cluster. You wanted the galaxy to remember, so do we. Let us both get exactly what we asked for. And she stepped down from the podium, and the war of correction began. And 11,000 years of Vrahel certainty had exactly 41 days left to live. 200 light-years from the Hall of Long Accounts, aboard the human battle cruiser Anvil of Reason, a young weapons officer named Sina Akoro was watching the declaration on a repeater screen and doing the math. She was 26 years old, which by the standards of her crew made her neither the youngest nor a veteran, and she wore the single silver bar of a lieutenant, junior grade, on a uniform that still smelled faintly of the requisition locker. She had graduated from the Galactic Academy's gunnery track 18 months ago, third in her class, and she had spent every one of those 18 months believing that the great war she had trained for was a theoretical exercise, a thing that lived in simulation and doctrine, and the tired stories of instructors who had never fired a shot in anger, because there had been no anger to fire it in. Now the largest empire in the arm had declared that it intended to unbuild her species, and Sina Akoro was doing math. She was not doing the math of fear, though there was plenty of fear available and she felt her share of it. She was doing the math of a gunner, which is a specific and unsentimental kind of thinking. She was watching the Vrahel High Reader's Leviathan Bone Chamber, and she was calculating how much kinetic energy it would take to reduce that chamber to a fine expanding cloud, and how long the projectile would take to arrive, and how you would correct for the movement of the star it orbited. And she found the answers came to her cleanly, the way answers do when a person has spent 10,000 hours making them come cleanly. "You're doing it again," said a voice beside her. Sina did not look away from the screen. Doing what? "The face, you get a face." Right before an exam, Petty Officer Quaim Assant, the Anvil's senior fire control technician, folded his arms and leaned against the bulkhead beside her. He was older than she was by a decade and had exactly zero interest in the chain of command when no officers senior to Sina were in the compartment. "You're solving him, the bone guy." "I'm not solving him." "You're absolutely solving him. What you get?" Sina finally looked away from the screen. 940 megajoules on the leading round if you wanted the chamber and not just the delegate, but you'd never get the shot. It's 140 light years inside their space. You'd have to put the launcher inside their gravity well, and they'd see the drive plume for a week before it arrived. Quaim grinned. "See? Solving him. It was an exercise. It's always an exercise until it isn't." He nodded at the screen where the ambassador's calm face was still frozen on the frame after her reply. "You catch what she said? Let us both get exactly what we asked for. That's not diplomat talk. Diplomats never let you have what you asked for. That's a threat wearing a suit." He pushed off the bulkhead. "Command's going to want us at battle stations before the hour's out. You want my advice? Go check your feeds, all of them. Every round and every rail on the ship, because whatever the ambassador just agreed to, we are the answer to it." He was right, of course. He was right about all of it. But it would be 3 more days before Sina Akoro understood exactly how right. And by then the anvil of reason would be one small part of a machine so large and so patient, and so precisely built that even the humans who had built it spoke of it in lowered voices, as though naming it too loudly might make the galaxy afraid before it was time. The machine had a name. Later, historians would call it many things: the correction fleet, the answer, the long line. But the people who served in it, the gunners and the loaders and the fire control techs and the young weapons officers doing math on repeater screens, called it by the name it had been given in the deep committee rooms of Earth's Naval Command, back when it was still a plan and not yet a fleet. They called it full stop. To understand what full stop was, you had to understand what the Vrahel had gotten wrong about humanity, and to understand that, you had to understand the railgun. The Vrahel fought with beams. So did almost everyone in the Concordance. Coherent light, particle streams, the exotic lattice weapons of the old species. These were the currency of galactic war, and they were beautiful and they were fast, and they had one shared, quiet, fatal characteristic that no one in 11,000 years had thought hard enough about. A beam weapon fired energy. And energy, out at the ranges of real space combat, spread. It dispersed. It bled off into the dark. A beam that could core a moon at 10,000 kilometers was a warm caress at 10 million, and every species in the Concordance had built their tactics, their ships, their entire understanding of war around that fact. You closed to beam range. You fought in the knife fight envelope. You accepted that space combat was, ultimately, an intimate thing. Humanity had looked at all of this, very politely, for 100 years, and had said nothing, and had gone home and built something else. A railgun did not fire energy. It fired mass. It took a projectile, a slug of dense, layered metal, no larger than a human forearm, and it accelerated that mass down a magnetic rail to a velocity that beggared comprehension, and then it let go. And mass, unlike energy, did not disperse. Mass did not bleed off into the dark. A slug launched at a fraction of the speed of light would travel in a perfectly straight line forever until it hit something, and when it hit something it would deliver every joule of the energy that had been poured into it, undiminished by distance, unweakened by range. A railgun round fired at 10 million kilometers arrived with exactly the same lethality as one fired at 10,000. The dark did not weaken it. Nothing weakened it. It simply arrived. There was only one problem with the railgun, and it was the problem that had caused every other species to abandon the concept in their own ancient histories, back before beams. To hit a moving target across 10 million kilometers of space with an unguided slug, you had to know with perfect precision where that target would be at the exact instant the slug arrived, which might be minutes after you fired. You had to account for the target's velocity, its acceleration, its possible evasion. You had to account for the gravity of every mass between here and there. You had to account for the rotation of the galaxy itself. It was a problem of computation and prediction and discipline so total, so unforgiving, that the ancient species had all, one by one, decided it was easier to build a beam. Humanity had decided it was easier to build a better gunner. This was the thing the Vrahel had gotten wrong. They had measured humanity's ships and found them lightly armed by beam standards. They had measured humanity's fleet and found it small. They had never thought to measure the thing that Sina Akoro had been building for 10,000 hours in the simulation bays of the Galactic Academy. The human capacity to solve, under pressure in the dark, the exact math of where a thing would be, and to put a piece of metal there, undiminished, across a gulf so wide that the enemy would never even see the launch. The Vrahel fought a war of intimacy. Humanity had built a war of distance, and distance, it turned out, was the one thing the galaxy had never learned to be afraid of. Full stop was 312 ships. Not one of them was a match for a Vrahel warmoon in a beam duel, and every human admiral in the fleet knew it, and not one of them intended to fight a beam duel. Full stop was built around a single, cold, disciplined idea. The humans would never let the Vrahel close to beam range. They would find the enemy across the vast dark, and they would solve the math, and they would fire, and the enemy would die at a range where they could not even fire back, and they would never understand why. It required perfect gunnery. It required gunners who did not miss, because a railgun war was a war with no second chances at close range. If the enemy ever closed, the humans lost. Everything depended on the shot arriving, and arriving first, and arriving true. Everything depended on people like Sina Akoro. She did not know any of that yet, not the scale of it, when the battle station's klaxon finally sounded, and she strapped herself into the fire control saddle at the heart of the anvil of reason. She knew only her ship, her rails, her feeds, and the math. The anvil carried 6 main rails, each one running nearly the full length of the ship's 400-meter spine, and Sina's station sat at the convergence of all 6. A cradle of screens and haptic controls where the ship's entire killing capacity resolved into the decisions of a single officer and her team. Around her in a ring sat her fire control crew, Quame at the feeds, a loader chief named Badu running the magazine, 2 junior techs on prediction, and a solemn ensign fresh from the academy named Paul who had not yet fired a round outside of a simulation, and whose hands, Sina noticed, were very steady, which either meant he was calm or meant he had not yet understood. "Talk to me," Sina said, and her voice came out level, and she was distantly proud of that. "Feeds are green," Quame said. "All 6 rails charged and holding, magazines hot, predictions up and synced with the flag." Synced with the flag, Sina frowned. That was new. In every exercise she had ever run, the anvil solved its own fire. We're taking targeting from the flagship. We're taking coordination from the flagship. A new voice, Commander Idrin Hale, the anvil's captain, who had come up the ladder into the fire control ring so quietly that even Sina had not heard her. She was a lean, gray-eyed woman who had the rare gift of making a compartment feel calmer by entering it. Listen closely, Lieutenant, because this is the part they couldn't teach you at the academy, because we hadn't invented it yet. She put a hand on the back of Sina's saddle. We are not fighting this war as 312 ships. We are fighting it as one gun with 312 barrels. The Vrahel are going to bring a war moon and its escort into the Meridian system in about 60 hours, expecting to fight us at beam range. They will never get there. We are going to engage them from 4 million kilometers out, from a dispersed formation they cannot even resolve as a fleet, and every ship in full stop is going to fire on a shared solution, at a shared instant, at a shared point in space. 300 rails, one shot, one point. Sina felt something cold and enormous open up in her chest, the way it does when a person glimpses the true size of a thing. A wall, she said quietly. Commander Hale nodded. A wall, we call it a curtain shot. 300 slugs arriving at 1 cubic kilometer of space at the same 10-millisecond window, from a range where the enemy hasn't even seen our launch flash yet. Nothing survives it. Not a war moon. Not anything. She straightened. And the reason I'm telling you, Lieutenant Okoro, instead of one of the gunners with gray in their hair, is that the anvil has been assigned as a solution anchor. 12 ships in this formation are going to slave their prediction to yours. Your math is going to be 6% of the curtain. Sina stared at her. Third in your class, the commander said, and there was no unkindness in it, only fact. The best raw predictive gunner in this task group. I read your file before I read anyone else's. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I want the honest answer, because there is no room in a curtain shot for a gunner who lies to herself. She leaned down. In 60 hours, when I give the order, are you going to be able to put your rounds inside a cube 1 kilometer wide, 4 million kilometers away, on a target that is trying to live? Because if the answer is no, I need to know now, and I will not think less of you. But if the answer is yes, then a great many people are going to be alive tomorrow who would otherwise be dead. And a great many of the enemy are going to learn what my ambassador meant when she told them to get exactly what they asked for. The compartment was very quiet. Quaim had stopped pretending to look at his feeds. Ensign Paul's steady hands had gone still. Sina Okoro thought about the 10,000 hours. She thought about the Leviathan bone chamber and the 940 megajoules. She thought about a species that had looked at 100 years of human politeness and called it weakness. Yes, she said, I can put them in the cube. Commander Hale looked at her for a long moment, and then she nodded once, and something in the nod felt like a door closing on the old, safe world of exercises and simulations, and opening onto whatever came next. Then let's go teach the galaxy some geometry, the commander said, and she climbed back down out of the ring and left the war in the hands of the young. The 60 hours before the Meridian engagement were the strangest of Sina Okoro's life, because nothing happened, and the nothing was the most demanding thing she had ever done. There was no enemy to see. The Vrahel war moon and its escort were still light towers out, a smudge of drive plumes on the deep sensors, closing on the Meridian system with the unhurried confidence of a species that had won this war 11,000 times before it started. And so the humans did the only thing that could win a railgun war, which was to prepare the shot so completely that when the moment came, there would be nothing left to decide. Sina did not sleep so much as she paused. She would work the prediction models until her eyes swam, refining the solution, feeding in every new scrap of data from the deep sensors. The war moon's exact mass, its drive signature, the subtle wobble in its course that told her how it corrected, how it steered, how it would try to live when it finally understood it was dying. Then she would close her eyes for an hour in the fire control saddle, and Quame would refine the feeds, and then she would open her eyes and work again. "You have to sleep sometime," Quame told her, somewhere around the 40th hour, pressing a bulb of coffee into her hands. "I sleep between the numbers," Sina said. It was a gunner's joke, an old one, and Quame smiled at it the way you smile at a thing that is true and grim at once. The math of the curtain shot was the most beautiful and terrible thing Sina had ever built. She had been trained to solve a single shot from a single rail, to know where a target would be and to put a slug there. This was different. This was 300 rails from 300 ships, scattered across 4 million kilometers of space, in a formation so dispersed that no single point of it could be seen as a fleet. Each ship's slugs had to arrive at the same instant, at the same cubic kilometer, from 300 slightly different angles, having traveled 300 slightly different distances at 300 slightly different launch times. It was not one shot. It was 300 shots choreographed to converge, and the choreography had to be perfect, because a curtain shot with holes in it was just a very expensive way to announce your position to an enemy who now knew where you were and was coming for you at beam range. And Sina's math was the anchor for 12 of those ships, 6% of the wall. She found in the long hours that she was not afraid in the way she had expected to be. The fear was there, it lived in her stomach like a swallowed stone, but it did not touch her hands and it did not touch the numbers. The numbers were clean. The numbers were the one place in the universe where the Vrahel certainty did not reach, because the Vrahel had never learned to think this way, had never needed to, had won all their wars up close where the intimacy of a beam made prediction unnecessary. Out here, in the deep math of distance, Sina Akoro was standing on ground the enemy did not even know existed. "Can I ask you something?" Ensign Paul said on the 51st hour. He had proven over the long wait to be neither calm nor naive but simply young in the particular way that meant he asked questions other people had learned to stop asking. "Why railguns? I know the doctrine answer. Mass doesn't disperse, but we could have built beams too, better beams. We're good engineers. Why did Earth decide the whole war would be this?" Sina thought about it. She had asked the same question once of an academy instructor, and the answer had stayed with her. "Because a beam is a threat," she said, "and a slug is a promise." Paul frowned. "I don't follow." "A beam weakens with distance, so the enemy always has a chance. Close the range, spread the shot, jink at the right moment, and maybe the beam that would have cored you at knife range only scorches your armor at 10 million kilometers. A beam war is a war of maybes. It's negotiable. The enemy can always tell themselves a story where they survive it." Sina turned in her saddle to look at him. "A slug doesn't weaken. There's no maybe in it. If the math is right and the slug is launched, then the enemy is already dead. They just don't know it yet. It's already happened. The war is a promise we made hours ago that the universe is going to keep whether they want it to or not." She turned back to her screens. "The Vrahel fight a war they can argue with. We're bringing them a war that's already over." Paul was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, softly, "That's the most frightening thing I've ever heard anyone say." "Yeah," Sina said, "it's supposed to be." The Vrahel, for their part, did exactly what the Vrahel had done 11,000 times before. They came in slow and certain, their war moon at the center, a genuine celestial body, 9 kilometers across, hollowed and armored and studded with beam lattices that could scour a continent to glass. Around it moved its escort, 40 smaller vessels, none of them small, each one a fortress in its own right, arranged in the dense protective sphere that had won the Vrahel every war they had ever fought. It was a formation built for beam combat, built to bring overwhelming coherent light firepower to bear at the moment of contact, built on the assumption, the 11,000-year-old, never once wrong assumption, that the enemy would have to come close to fight. They broadcast as they came. That was the Vrahel way. The High Reader's voice rolled ahead of the war moon on every frequency, patient and vast. addressed to the human fleet they had not yet located. Humans, we know you are in the Meridian system. We know you are hiding. This is not a criticism. It is what small things do. When we find you, and we will find you because we always find them, we will unbuild you slowly and we will broadcast it so that the galaxy remembers. You accepted this war. You did not have to. Your ambassador's pride has cost you everything. There is still a mercy available. Show yourselves. Come to us. Let us do this cleanly at close range, as war is meant to be done, and we will make your ending swift. Hide and we will make it long. On the anvil of reason, Sina listened to the broadcast and felt the swallowed stone in her stomach turn over, because there was something in the High Reader's voice that was not theater. He believed it. He genuinely believed that the humans were hiding, that they were afraid, that the only question left was the manner of their diminishment. He believed it because for 11,000 years it had always been true. He thinks we're hiding, she said aloud. Commander Hale had come back up into the fire control ring for the final approach. We are hiding, Lieutenant, she said. We're just not hiding for the reason he thinks. He thinks we're hiding because we're afraid to be seen. We're hiding because a curtain shot only works once. The instant we fire, they know exactly where 300 ships are, and if the first shot doesn't finish them, we're in a beam war we lose. She watched the plot, where the Vrahel formation crept inward, a dense bright sphere against the dark. So we don't miss. That's the whole doctrine. We don't miss. The Vrahel formation crossed the 6 million kilometer mark. Then the 5 million. On the plot, the human ships remained dark, scattered, silent, 312 points of cold patience arranged in a shell around the incoming enemy at a range the Vrahel still considered irrelevant. A range at which no beam in the galaxy could reach with meaningful force. A range that the Vrahel's entire understanding of war told them was empty, safe, nothing. 4 million too, Quaim murmured. Solutions holding, flags holding, they haven't slaved us yet. Sina's hands rested on the haptic controls. 12 ships were slaved to her math. 6% of the wall. She watched the War Moon's course, the tiny corrections it made, the wobble that told her how it would try to steer, and she updated the prediction one final time, feeding the correction to the 12 ships that trusted her, and she felt the whole vast machine of full stop settle into a single held breath. 4 million even, Quaim said. This is the range. This is where the doctrine says we fire. But the order did not come. Sina felt it in the compartment, the taut wrongness of it. The range was right. The solution was locked. Every gunner in the fleet was ready. And the flagship held its silence, and the seconds stretched, and the War Moon came on. Why aren't we firing? Paul whispered. Commander Hale's jaw was tight. She was listening to something on the command channel, something the fire control ring could not hear. And then her face changed, a flicker of something Sina had not seen on her before and would spend the rest of her life trying to name. It was not fear. It was closer to grief. There's a complication, the commander said quietly. The complication had a name, and the name was the Concordance Observer. No one in full stop had known it was there. It was a small vessel, unarmed, neutral, carrying the credentials of the Concordance's own council, a species called the Elith, keepers of the long accounts, whose entire purpose was to witness the wars of others and record them truly, so that the galaxy's history would not be written only by the winners. The Elith observer had followed the Vrahel War Moon into the Meridian system to witness the correction of humanity. It had expected to record a slaughter. It had positioned itself, for the best view, very close to the War Moon. Very close. The problem resolved itself on Sina's plot a moment after Commander Hale spoke, when the flagship finally shared the reason for its silence. The Elith observer sat inside the Vrahel escort sphere, less than 2,000 kilometers from the War Moon, drifting in the exact volume of space where the curtain shot was going to arrive. 300 slugs converging on 1 cubic kilometer would not spare a neutral vessel 2,000 kilometers away. The curtain was not a scalpel. It was a wall of undiminished mass, and everything in its footprint would cease to exist in the same 10-millisecond window. If full stop fired the curtain shot now, it would kill the war moon, and it would also kill the one neutral witness the Concordance had sent to record the truth of the war. And the Vrahel, who missed nothing, would broadcast that killing to 900 worlds. Humanity would have won the battle and lost the galaxy. The species that had accepted a war of correction with such cold dignity would be remembered not as the ones who answered the Vrahel, but as the ones who murdered the Concordance's own eyes to do it. They put the observer there on purpose, Sina said, and the understanding was bitter in her mouth. The Vrahel, they knew about the curtain doctrine. They couldn't have, but they hedged against it. They tucked a neutral witness into the kill zone so that if we did have some trick, using it would cost us everything. We don't know that they did it on purpose, Commander Hale said. Does it matter? The commander was silent because it did not matter. On purpose or by chance, the result was the same. The war moon was 4 million kilometers away and closing. The solution was perfect. 300 rails were charged and waiting, and the one shot that could win the war would also lose it. And the range was closing. Every second the war moon came nearer to beam contact, nearer to the range where the human doctrine failed and the Vrahel doctrine ruled, nearer to the intimate knife fight the humans could not win. The window for the curtain shot was not infinite. Fire too late and the enemy would be inside beam range, would see the launch, would kill the human ships before the slugs even arrived. The curtain worked only at distance, only in the dark, only as a promise made before the enemy knew a promise was being made. How long do we have? Sina asked. Quame's voice was tight. At current closure, the curtain window closes in about 40 minutes. After that, they're too close. We fire before then or we don't fire at all, and if we don't fire the curtain, we're in a beam war against a war moon. He didn't have to finish it. Everyone in the ring knew how a beam war against a war moon ended. 40 minutes to solve an impossible problem. Kill the witness and lose the galaxy, or spare the witness and lose the battle, and with it, everything. Sina Akoro looked at the plot. She looked at the Vrahel escort sphere, dense and bright and certain, and the tiny neutral point of the Elith observer sitting inside it, and the war moon at its heart, and she felt the old cold math begin to move in her mind. Not the math of fear, and not even the math of the curtain, but a new math, a harder one, the kind of math that lived in the space between what the doctrine allowed and what the moment required. Because there was a version of the shot that could work. She could feel the edge of it, the way a gunner feels the edge of a solution before the numbers resolve. It was not the curtain. The curtain was a wall, and a wall could not spare anything. What she needed was not a wall. What she needed was a needle. Commander, Sina said slowly, and every head in the fire control ring turned toward her. The curtain's off the table, I know, but the curtain isn't the only shot we have. It's just the only one we've ever practiced. She was already pulling the war moon's exact geometry onto her main screen, the escort sphere, the position of the observer, the angles. The escort is arranged for beam defense. Dense sphere, overlapping fields, everything pointed outward. But they've never faced railgun fire, so they've never learned to think about it. There are lanes through that sphere, corridors. Angles where a slug could thread between the escorts and reach the war moon without ever coming within 2,000 kilometers of the observer. Commander Hale came to stand behind her saddle, staring at the screen. You're talking about a threaded shot through a moving defensive sphere at 4 million kilometers. I'm talking about a threaded shot through a moving defensive sphere at 4 million kilometers, Sina agreed. Her voice was very calm, and underneath the calm the swallowed stone had become something else, not fear anymore, but the particular clean focus that 10,000 hours had been building toward without her ever knowing it. It can't be a curtain. A curtain can't miss the observer, but a needle can, if the math is perfect. If every slug threads the exact lane, arrives at the exact instant, misses the observer by the exact margin and puts every jewel into the war moon and nothing else. She looked up at the commander. I can build that shot, but I can't do it as one of 300 ships firing a shared solution. The curtain math and the needle math are opposites. Somebody has to solve the needle, ship by ship, lane by lane, and hold 300 rails to a tolerance we've never fired at. She swallowed. It has to be one gunner, one solution for the whole fleet. The compartment had gone utterly silent. Commander Hale looked at her for a long, long moment. And then, very quietly, she opened the command channel, and she said the words that would put the entire war of correction into the hands of a 26-year-old lieutenant, junior grade, who had never fired a round in anger. Flag, this is Anvil. My anchor gunner has a shot. Recommend you hear it before that window closes. And Flag, the commander's gray eyes did not leave Cena's face. Recommend you hear it fast. The flagship of Full Stop was called the Cold Arithmetic, and the woman who commanded it was Admiral Teodora Cashin, and she had 38 minutes to decide whether to trust the fleet's one shot to a lieutenant she had never met. She did not waste them. Put the gunner on, Admiral Cashin said, and a moment later her voice came through into the Anvil's fire control ring, dry and unhurried, the voice of someone who had commanded fleets long enough to know that panic was a luxury and calm was a weapon. Lieutenant Okoro, I have your file open. I know your scores. I don't have time to be gentle, so I'm going to be fast. My gunnery board tells me a threaded shot through a live defensive sphere at 4 million kilometers has never been fired, never been simulated, and is not survivable if it fails, because the instant we fire and miss, the Vrahel know our positions and close to beam range and we lose the fleet. My board recommends we take the curtain shot, accept the observer's death, and let the diplomats manage the fallout. Tell me why they're wrong. Cena's mouth was dry. Somewhere behind her, she was aware of Commander Hale's steadying presence, and of Quame's hands moving across the feeds, and of Ensign Paul watching her with an expression she could not read. But mostly she was aware of the plot, the escort sphere, the lanes she could see running through it like corridors of empty space that no one else had learned to look for. Admiral, she said, your board is thinking about this as a gunnery problem, and it is, but it's also a geometry problem, and the geometry is on our side. She began to talk faster, the way she did when the numbers were flowing. The Vrahel escort sphere is built for beam defense. It's dense, but it's dense in a specific way. The escorts overlap their fields to cover every angle a beam could come from, and to do that they have to hold specific relative positions. Those positions create gaps, not gaps in their beam coverage, gaps in physical space, corridors between the hulls, wide enough for a slug and nothing else. A beam couldn't use those corridors because a beam would clip the escort fields and disperse. But a slug doesn't care about their fields. A slug is just mass. It goes where the geometry lets it go. And you can see these corridors. I can see them and I can predict them because the escorts hold formation. That's their whole doctrine, hold the sphere, cover every angle. They can't break formation without opening a beam defense gap they're terrified of. So they're going to hold, which means the corridors are going to stay open, which means I can solve for a slug that threads a corridor, misses every escort, misses the observer by a 2,000-kilometer margin, and puts all its energy into the war moon. Cena pulled up the solution she had been building, throwing it to the flagship's board. Not 300 slugs in a wall. 300 slugs in 300 needles, each one threaded through its own corridor, all arriving at the war moon in the same window, from the same fleet on one solution. Ship by ship, lane by lane. There was a silence on the command channel. Cena could imagine the flagship's gunnery board tearing into her math, looking for the flaw, and she waited, because she had built the math clean and she trusted it, and trusting the math was the only thing a gunner had. My board says, Admiral Cashin said finally slowly, that your solution is elegant and that it has one problem. It requires every rail in the fleet to hold a tolerance an order of magnitude tighter than the curtain shot. A curtain shot forgives error, 300 slugs at 1 cubic kilometer. A little scatter doesn't matter. The wall's still a wall. Your needle shot forgives nothing. A slug that's off by a fraction of a degree doesn't miss the war moon. It hits an escort, or worse, it hits the observer, and then we've killed the witness anyway and missed the target and given away our positions all at once. My board says the tolerance is beyond what a fleet can hold. Your board is right about the tolerance, Sina said. It's wrong about what a fleet can hold. She took a breath. Admiral, that tolerance is beyond what 300 gunners can hold, all solving their own fire because 300 gunners means 300 tiny errors. But it's not beyond what one solution can hold if every rail in the fleet slaves to it. One gunner, one solution. Every ship fires the exact math I give them, at the exact instant I give them, and the errors don't stack because there's only one mind making the decision. I can hold that tolerance. I've been holding it in simulation for 18 months without knowing what it was for. She looked at the plot, at the war moon, at the tiny neutral point of the observer. You asked me on the anvil if I could put my rounds in a cube 1 kilometer wide. I told you yes. This is smaller. This is harder. And the answer is still yes. Another silence, longer this time. Sina became aware that she had, without quite intending to, just volunteered to take personal command of every weapon in the fleet, and that if she was wrong, 312 ships would die because of her arrogance, and that the last thing 11,000 years of galaxy would remember about humanity was a young gunner who thought she was better than the math. Lieutenant Okoro, Admiral Cashin said, "Do you understand what you're asking me to do?" "Yes, Admiral. You're asking me to give the fleet's fire to one saddle, to make 312 ships fire on the word of a lieutenant, junior grade, who has never fired a round in anger. If you're wrong, we don't lose a battle. We lose the war, the fleet, and the species, all in the same 10 milliseconds. Every doctrine I've ever been taught tells me not to do this." "I know, Admiral. So tell me the last thing. Tell me the thing that isn't in your file." The Admiral's voice softened just slightly, and it was more frightening than her hardness had been. "Why should I believe you can do what no gunner has ever done, on the first try, with no rehearsal, with everything on the line?" Sina thought about it. She thought about the Leviathan bone chamber and the High Reader's certainty and the Ambassador's still face. She thought about 10,000 hours in the simulation bays, every one of them a rehearsal for a shot no one had ever named. She thought about what her instructor had told her, the day she asked why humanity had chosen the railgun, and she gave the Admiral the only answer that was true. "Because I'm not trying to do something no gunner has ever done," Sina said. "I'm trying to do the thing every human gunner has been trained to do since we built the first rail. Put mass exactly where it needs to be, across any distance, undiminished. The Vrahel think this is impossible because for them it would be. They fight a war of energy, and energy is negotiable, and they've spent 11,000 years learning to think in maybes. We fight a war of mass. There are no maybes in mass. The slug goes where the math sends it, and I am very, very good at the math." She let that sit for a heartbeat. "You don't have to believe in me, Admiral. You just have to believe in the arithmetic, and the arithmetic doesn't miss." For a long moment, the command channel was silent. Then Admiral Teodora Cashin, commanding the fleet, called full stop, made the decision that 11,000 years of Vrahel certainty had never once accounted for. She trusted the young. "Fleet, this is the cold arithmetic," the Admiral said, and her voice went out on the command channel to 312 ships. "New doctrine effective now. All rails slave to fire control solution designated needle, originating anvil of reason, gunner of record Lieutenant Sina Okoro. Every ship in this fleet will fire the solution she gives you at the instant she gives it to the tolerance she demands. We are no longer 312 ships. We are one gun, and Lieutenant Okoro is the finger on the trigger. God help us all if I've read her wrong. cashing out. The channel closed, and Sina Okoro, 26 years old, sat in the fire control saddle of the anvil of reason, with the fire of an entire fleet resting in her hands, and 31 minutes on the window, and she said, very quietly, to the crew around her, "Okay, let's build a needle." The next 29 minutes were the hardest work Sina Okoro would ever do, and she did it in near total silence, and the silence was the most frightening thing about it. Because there was no drama in it. That was the thing the stories always got wrong, the thing the recruiting dramas and the academy pageants never understood. The moment the fate of a species hangs on a single mind, there is no shouting, no defiant speeches, no music. There is only a young woman in a saddle, her eyes moving across a plot, her fingers adjusting a solution by fractions of a degree, her voice occasionally murmuring a correction to a crew that has gone as still and focused as she is. The war of the whole galaxy came down to arithmetic, and arithmetic is quiet. "Give me the escort formation refresh every 10 seconds, Sina said. "I need to watch the corridors breathe." Because the corridors did breathe, that was the hardest part. The escort sphere was not static. The 40 Vrahal fortresses held their relative positions, yes, but the whole sphere drifted and rotated as the war moon steered, and so the corridors between the hulls opened and closed and shifted in a slow, complex dance, and Sina had to solve not for where the corridors were, but for where each one would be at the exact instant a slug threaded it, minutes after launch, having crossed 4 million kilometers of dark. She built it lane by lane. 300 rails, 300 corridors, except it was not that simple, because some corridors were wide enough for a dozen slugs and some for only one, and the widest corridors were the ones the escorts were most likely to close as the sphere drifted, and so she had to choose, for each rail, not the easiest lane but the one that would still be open at the instant of arrival. She had to think 3 minutes into the future for 300 separate pieces of metal, and she had to be right about all of them, because a needle shot forgives nothing. "Corridor 7's closing," Quaim said. "Escorts drifting into it." "I see it, reassigning the 12 rails on 7 to Corridor 9 and Corridor 11. Recompute their launch windows." Sina's fingers moved. 9 takes 8 rails, 11 takes 4. "Badu, confirm the magazine can hold that split." "Magazine confirms," the loader chief said. Ensign Paul, on prediction, was watching her work with a kind of awe he had stopped trying to hide. "How are you tracking all of it?" he said, almost involuntarily. 300 rails, 300 corridors, all moving." "I'm not tracking 300 things," Sina said without looking up. "I'm tracking one thing, the shape of the shot. It's like she searched for it, it's like a piece of music. Every note is separate, but you don't play a symphony by thinking about each note. You hear the whole shape and the notes fall into place. The shot has a shape. I'm holding the shape. The rails are the notes." Her fingers moved again. "Corridor 9 stable, locking 8 rails on 9, 22 minutes. The war moon came on. On every frequency, the high reader's voice continued its slow, certain sermon, unaware, still addressing an enemy it believed was hiding in terror, and every word of it now was a strange, dark accompaniment to Sina's silent work, the enemy narrating its own confidence into the last minutes of its existence, never knowing that 4 million kilometers away, in the dark it could not see into, a young human was quietly, patiently, note by note, composing the exact geometry of its end. "Humans," the high reader said, "we are closing now. Soon we will be within range and we will find you and the correction will begin. There is still time to show yourselves and receive the swift ending. Your silence is not courage. It is only fear that has run out of words. We know this silence. Every species we have corrected has fallen silent like this at the end. It is the silence of the small, understanding at last that they are small." In the fire control saddle, Sina Okoro heard him and did not stop working and thought, "You're wrong about the silence too. It's not the silence of the small understanding they're small. It's the silence of the gunner doing the math. "14 minutes to window close," Quaim said. "Solutions at 90%, every corridor assigned. We're threading it, Sina. We're actually threading it." 90% isn't 90% good enough, Sina said. "A needle at 90% is 300 slugs in the wrong place. Give me the last 10. Refresh the observer's position. I need its exact vector, because if the war moon steers hard in the last minute, the whole sphere shifts, and I need to know the observer stays clear even if they jink." Her eyes narrowed at the plot. "Paul, run me the worst case. If the war moon does the hardest evasion its mass allows in the last 60 seconds before arrival, where does the observer end up relative to my slugs?" Paul ran it. His face went pale. "If they jink hard toward corridor 19, the observer drifts into the path of the 4 rails threading corridor 21. 2,000-kilometer margin drops to 200. That's Sina. That's inside the error bar." The compartment went cold. Sina stared at the plot. There it was, the flaw the flagship's board had been looking for, the one crack in the impossible shot. If the war moon evaded in one specific direction in the last seconds, 4 of her 300 rails would send their slugs close enough to the observer that the margin evaporated, and she would kill the witness after all, and lose the galaxy in the moment of winning the war. 4 rails out of 300. A 1 in 100 chance that the enemy would jink in exactly that direction. Any commander in the galaxy would have taken the odds. 99% was a certainty by the standards of war. Fire the shot, take the tiny risk, kill the war moon. Sina Akaro looked at the 4 rails threading corridor 21, and at the Elith observer, the neutral witness sent to record the truth of the war, so that the galaxy's history would not be written only by the winners. And she thought about what humanity was actually fighting for, and she made a choice that no doctrine had taught her, because the doctrine had never imagined a gunner good enough to have the choice. "Pull corridor 21, she said. "All 4 rails, take them off the shot entirely." Quaim turned to stare at her. "That's 4 rails of firepower off the war moon. You want to weaken the shot." "I want the shot that can't kill the observer even in the worst case," Sina said. "Not the shot that probably won't, can't. Reassign the 4 rails to a holding solution. I want them ready, but they don't fire on the war moon. If the enemy jinks toward the observer, those 4 rails fire a different shot. A blocking shot. Slugs into the empty space between the enemy and the observer, close enough to force the war moon to break off its evasion or run into our fire. We herd them away from the witness." Paul's eyes went wide. "You'd use railgun rounds as a fence." "I'd use railgun rounds as a promise," Sina said. "The same promise as always. Mass, exactly where it needs to be. Sometimes where it needs to be is inside the enemy, and sometimes where it needs to be is the one place the enemy can't go." She locked the 4 rails onto the holding solution. 9 minutes. Recompute the whole shot with 296 rails on the war moon and 4 on the fence. Confirm the war moon still dies. The numbers resolved. Quaim read them off, and his voice was quiet with something like reverence. 296 rails. War moon still dies. Overkill's down from 400% to 380. Observers clear in every case, including worst-case jink. He looked up. "Sina, it works. The whole thing works." Sina Akoro sat back in the saddle, just for a moment, and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 18 months. "Then let's tell the fleet," she said, "that the shot is ready. Flag, this is Anvil. Solution needle is complete and locked. 296 rails on the war moon, 4 on a protective fence. Observer is clear in all cases. Requesting release authority." Admiral Cashin's voice came back without hesitation. "Anvil, explain the fence. My board sees 4 rails not firing on target and wants to know why." Sina explained it in 12 seconds, the worst-case jink, the 200-kilometer margin, the 4 rails held to herd the enemy away from the witness. When she finished, there was a pause, And then Admiral Cashin said something that Sina would remember for the rest of her life. "Lieutenant," the Admiral said, "I've commanded gunners for 30 years. Most of them, given a 99% shot, take it and never think about the 1%. You looked at the 1% and built a whole second shot to close it, and you did it in 9 minutes on your own without being asked. A breath. That's not gunnery, that's judgment. And judgment is the thing I was told a young officer wouldn't have. A longer pause. You have release authority. The fleet is yours. Fire when the shape is right. Cashin out. The fleet is yours." Sina Akoro looked around the fire control ring, at Quaim, at Badu, at Paul, at Commander Hale standing silent behind her saddle with an expression of fierce, quiet pride. And then she looked at the plot, at the war moon and its escort sphere and the corridors breathing through it and the neutral witness safe at its margin. And she put both hands on the haptic controls, and she began to fire the shot that would end the war of correction. It did not happen the way the beam fighters of the Concordance would have understood it. There was no roar, no cascade of light, no visible violence. A railgun does not flash the way a beam flashes. When Sina began to fire, the only outward sign was a faint shudder through the anvil's spine as the first rail discharged, and a corresponding tremor from 300 other ships scattered across 4 million kilometers of dark, and then nothing. Silence. Because the slugs were already gone, already crossing the void at a fraction of the speed of light, and there was nothing to see and nothing to hear, only the long, patient interval while the promise traveled toward the enemy who did not yet know it had been made. Sina fired the shot the way she had built it, as music. Not all at once, but in a precise sequence, rail by rail, ship by ship, each launch time to the fraction of a second so that slugs launched later from nearer ships and slugs launched earlier from farther ships would all converge on the war moon in the same 10-millisecond window, minutes from now, from 300 different angles, through 300 threaded corridors. She played the fleet like an instrument. Corridor by corridor, the notes fell into place. The anvil shuddered again and again as its own 6 rails discharged in their assigned sequence, and across the dark, 300 other ships shuddered with it, and none of it made a sound the enemy could hear. "All rails away," Quaim breathed when the last launch fired. 296 on target, 4 on the fence holding. Time to arrival 4 minutes, 11 seconds. He looked at the plot, at the void between the human fleet and the war moon, empty and dark and silent. "They're already dead, aren't they? They just don't know it." "Not yet," Sina said. Her eyes had not left the plot. "Watch the fence. If they jink, I have 4 seconds to fire it." And so they waited, the whole fire control ring, while the promise crossed the dark. On the war moon, the High Reader continued his sermon, oblivious. The Vrahel sensors, tuned for the drive plumes and energy signatures of an approaching enemy, saw nothing, because railgun slugs had no drive plume, no energy signature, nothing to detect but a cold sliver of inert metal too small and too fast and too far to register against the noise of the void. The most sophisticated sensor array in the outer arm of the Concordance looked directly at 300 incoming slugs and saw empty space, because it had been built by a species that had never learned to be afraid of mass, and it did not know what to look for. 3 minutes, Quaim said. 2 minutes. At the 90-second mark, the war moon jinked. It was not evasion. The Vrahel still did not know they were under fire. It was a course correction, a routine adjustment as the war moon closed on the coordinates where it expected to find and destroy the hidden human fleet. But it was a hard correction, harder than the models had predicted, and it swung the whole escort sphere in exactly the direction Paul had feared. And on the plot the Elith observer began to drift toward the path of Corridor 21. "There it is," Sina said, and her voice was very calm and her fingers were already moving, firing the fence. The 4 held rails discharged, not at the war moon, but into the empty volume of space between the drifting observer and the incoming slugs. 4 slugs, launched on a solution Cena had built 9 minutes ago and updated in real time, arcing into the exact corridor the war moon's course correction was carrying it toward. Not to hit the war moon. To be there. To occupy the space, so that when the war moon's sensors finally, belatedly, registered the 4 inbound slivers of metal on a collision course, the only evasion available would carry it away from the observer, not toward it. Fence away, Quaim said. Impact on fence solution, the war moon's going to detect those 4. They're close enough now. That's the point, Cena said. Let them see the 4. Let them run from the 4. 11 seconds later, the Vrahel war moon's sensors finally registered a threat, 4 inbound kinetic objects, small, fast, on a collision course from a direction the Vrahel had thought was empty. And the war moon did exactly what Cena had built the fence to make it do. It broke off its course correction. It jinked hard away from the 4 slugs, away from the corridor, away, precisely, helplessly, by the geometry Cena had laid down 9 minutes before from the Elith observer. The great 9-kilometer body heaved itself onto a new vector to avoid 4 pieces of metal it had detected far too late to matter. And in doing so, it moved the entire escort sphere back into the exact configuration that Cena's main shot had been threaded through. They corrected right back into the corridors, Paul whispered, watching it happen. They ran from the fence straight into the needle. Mass exactly where it needs to be, Cena said softly. Sometimes it's a wall, sometimes it's a fence, and sometimes it's a hand guiding them to the one place they need to stand. She watched the plot, the war moon settling onto its new vector, the escort sphere realigning, the 296 main slugs now 4 seconds from arrival threading corridors that the enemy's own panic had just reopened. 30 seconds. The high reader's voice was still going out on every frequency, and in the last half-minute of the war of correction, he was saying something about how the human silence had run out of words, how the small always fell quiet at the end, how the galaxy would remember this day as the day humanity learned its place. He was still speaking, still certain, still 11,000 years unbroken, when the promise arrived. 296 slugs threaded 296 corridors through a moving defensive sphere at 4 million kilometers, missed 40 escort fortresses by margins measured in hundreds of meters, missed a neutral witness by 2,000 safe kilometers, and struck the Vrahel war moon in the same 10-millisecond window, from every angle at once, each one delivering every joule of the energy that had been poured into it 4 minutes before, undiminished by distance, unweakened by the dark. In the last 4 seconds, Cena watched the plot with a stillness she would never be able to explain to anyone who had not sat in a fire control saddle. There was nothing left to do. The slugs were beyond recall, beyond adjustment, beyond her reach. 300 pieces of metal she had launched minutes ago, now converging on their target through corridors the enemy's own panic had reopened, and no power in the galaxy could change where they went. This was the strange, terrible piece at the heart of a railgun war, the thing the beam fighters would never understand. A beam gunner held the shot until the last instant, could correct, could chase, could argue with the outcome all the way to impact. A railgun gunner made the decision minutes early and then sat in the silence of a promise already made, unable to change it, only able to watch it keep itself. Cena had made her decision. The math was clean. There was nothing left but to see the universe honor it. There is no good way to describe what happens when that much mass arrives at that much velocity. The beam fighters of the Concordance had spent 11,000 years watching wars end in cascades of coherent light, in the slow scouring of hulls, in the intimate violence of the knife fight envelope. They had never seen a war moon simply cease. The 9-kilometer body did not burn. It did not crack and glow and die by degrees the way a beam-killed ship died. It was there, and then, in a single window too fast for any eye to follow, it was a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated debris, its entire structure converted to kinetic energy and light in the instant of 296 simultaneous impacts, each one arriving with the force of the acceleration that had been stored in it, all of them arriving at once. The war moon that had unbuilt the Thesson, that had corrected 900 worlds, that had ruled the outer arm for 11,000 years, ended in less time than it took the High Reader to finish the sentence he was speaking. His voice cut off mid-word. On every frequency across 900 worlds, the sermon of Vrahal's certainty simply stopped. And in the silence that followed, the vast, ringing, galactic silence, the 40 escort fortresses of the Vrahal fleet found themselves suddenly alone, their flagship gone, their sensors screaming with impossible data, their entire understanding of war shattered in a single instant. They had detected no attack. They had seen no launch, no beam, no approach. Their war moon had been there, invulnerable, certain, at the center of the densest defensive formation the galaxy had ever built, and then it had ceased to exist, and there was nothing to fire back at, because the enemy was 4 million kilometers away in a dark the Vrahal could not see into, and the weapon that had killed them left no trace at all. The Elith observer, safe at the margin, recorded all of it. Every sensor it carried, every account it kept, captured the truth of the thing exactly as it happened, the silent dark, the war moon whole, the war moon gone, the escort fleet suddenly leaderless and blind, and no visible cause at all. The neutral witness the Vrahal had tucked into the kill zone to make humanity's victory into a crime, recorded instead the purest demonstration of humanity's answer that the galaxy would ever see. An enemy corrected out of existence without ever knowing what corrected it, and a witness left alive, deliberately, precisely, to tell the galaxy the truth. In the fire control ring of the anvil of reason, no one spoke for a long moment. The plot showed it plainly, the war moon's icon gone, the escort fortresses scattering in confusion, the observer's neutral point pulsing safe and clear. Sina Akoro sat in the saddle with her hands still on the controls, and she found that she was shaking, very slightly, now that the shot was fired and the shape was complete, and there was nothing left to hold. "Confirmed kill," Quaim said quietly. "War moon's gone, total, observers clear. Escorts, Sina, the escorts breaking formation. They're running." "Let them run," Commander Hale said from behind the saddle. Her voice was rough. "Every one of them that runs is going to tell the story. That's worth more than killing them." She put a hand on Sina's shoulder. "You did it, Lieutenant. You threaded the needle." The whole galaxy just watched an 11,000-year empire's flagship die, and it never saw the shot, and the one witness they brought to condemn us is going to tell 900 worlds exactly what we are. Sina looked at the plot, at the expanding cloud where the war moon had been, and she thought about the ambassador's still face and the words she had spoken in the Hall of Long Accounts. "Let us both get exactly what we asked for." "They wanted the galaxy to remember," Sina said quietly. "They said we'd never been tested, never bled against a real fire." She let out a slow breath. "They got their example, it's just not the one they wanted." On the command channel, Admiral Cashin's voice came through, and it was not triumphant. It was something quieter and heavier and more permanent. "All ships, this is the cold arithmetic. Cease fire, hold positions, let the escort run. The war of correction is over." A pause. "Gunner of record for this engagement is Lieutenant Sina Akoro, Anvil of Reason. Let the log show that the fleet fired one shot and one gunner aimed it, and the galaxy will not soon forget either." A longer pause, and then softer, almost to herself. "God, it actually worked." But it was not quite over, because a war does not end when a flagship dies. It ends when the enemy understands what killed it. And the Vrahal, for all their certainty, were not stupid. They were about to become the first species in the galaxy to truly comprehend what humanity had built, and what that comprehension would cost them was not measured in ships. It was measured in 11,000 years of never being afraid. The escort fortresses ran, and they told the story, and the story spread across the concordance faster than any drive could carry a ship. It spread because the Elith Observer released its record, unedited, complete, exactly as its mandate required. And 900 worlds watched the truth of the Meridian engagement with a horror that had nothing to do with blood, because there was no blood to see. There was only the dark and the war moon whole and the war moon gone and no cause at all. The species of the Concordance had understood war as a thing you could see coming. A beam had a source. A charge had a plume. A fleet had a signature. You could measure the threat, calculate the odds, tell yourself a story where you survived. That was what war had always been. The Elith record showed them a war they could not see coming. It showed them an enemy that killed from a range where it could not be detected, with a weapon that left no trace, on a solution so precise that it spared the one witness by exact design. It showed them, above all, that the humans could have killed the observer and chosen not to, that the sparing was deliberate, was calculated, was a message. We can reach anything. We can miss anything we choose to miss. The distance you thought protected you does not exist for us. And 900 worlds understood, all at once, that they had spent 11,000 years being afraid of the wrong thing. For weeks afterward, the diplomatic channels of the Concordance carried a single frantic question, asked in 400 languages by 90 species who had all made the same quiet calculation about their own place in the galaxy. They did not ask how many ships humanity possessed, because ships had ceased to be the measure of anything. They asked how far a human slug could reach, and the answer that came back from the gunnery scholars who had studied the Elith record until their eyes bled was the answer that changed everything. There was no maximum range. A slug once launched did not slow, did not weaken, did not stop. It traveled in a straight line forever, undiminished, until it met something. The only limit on a human railgun was the patience of the gunner aiming it, and the precision of the math behind the shot, and humanity, the galaxy had just learned, had a great deal of both. A species that had waited 100 polite years to answer a single question was not a species that would run out of patience. And the math, everyone now understood, did not miss. The Vrahal Ascendancy sued for peace within the week. Not because they had run out of ships, they had thousands, but because their gunnery scholars, working from the Elith record, had finally understood the mathematics of what had killed their war moon, and the understanding had broken something in them that no defeat in battle ever could. They understood that there was no defense. You could not armor against a slug that arrived undiminished from beyond detection range. You could not evade what you could not see coming. You could not close to beam range against an enemy who would kill you across 4 million kilometers of dark before you crossed the first million. Every doctrine, every tactic, every certainty the Vrahal had built across 11,000 years assumed that war happened where you could see it. Humanity had built a war that happened where you could not. There was, the Vrahal scholars concluded, only one defense against the human answer: to never ever give humanity a reason to fire it. And so the war of correction ended not with humanity's diminishment, but with a new entry in the long accounts of the Concordance, an entry the Elith wrote with great care, because they understood they were recording the moment the balance of the galaxy changed. They wrote that the Vrahal Ascendancy had declared a war of correction against the species called human, expecting to make an example the galaxy would remember. They wrote that the galaxy would, indeed, remember. They wrote that it would remember a single shot, fired from a dark the enemy could not see into, aimed by a single gunner, that ended an 11,000-year empire certainty in the span of one sentence. And they wrote in the neutral exact language of the long accounts, the sentence that would be quoted for 1,000 years afterward. The humans do not fight a war of energy, which can be argued with. They fight a war of mass, which cannot. When they fire, the outcome has already happened. One does not survive a human decision. One is merely, eventually, informed of it. The peace itself was a strange, quiet thing, unlike any the Concordance had ever negotiated. The Vrahal did not surrender territory, and humanity did not demand any. There were no reparations, no tribunals, no marching of prisoners. There was only a single clause: written into the long accounts at humanity's insistence and the Vrahal's silent, grinding acceptance. And it was the clause that told the galaxy exactly what kind of species humanity had turned out to be. It stated that the ascendancy would return, intact and unharmed, every relic and record and living witness it had taken from the worlds it had unbuilt across 11,000 years. The Thessan archives, the Koru memory stones, the thousand small stolen histories of the diminished. Humanity asked for nothing for itself. It asked only that the accounts be balanced for the species the Vrahal had already corrected. And the galaxy, watching, understood the message beneath the clause as clearly as it had understood the sparing of the witness. We did not fight this war to take your place at the top of the dark. We fought it to prove that the top of the dark is not a place worth taking. The Vrahal scholars, reading the clause, felt the last of their certainty die, because they finally grasped that they had declared war not on a rival empire, but on something that had never wanted an empire at all, and that this, more than any weapon, was the thing they could never defeat. Sina Akaro did not become famous exactly, though her name was in the record, and the record was everywhere. She was too young, some said, and too junior, for the weight of what she had done to sit comfortably on the galaxy's understanding of it. The Concordance liked its heroes gray-haired and grave. It did not know what to do with a 26-year-old lieutenant, junior grade, who had held the fire of an entire fleet in her hands for 29 silent minutes and threaded a needle that no gunner had ever fired. So the record named her, and the scholars studied her math, and the story spread, and Sina Akoro went back to being a weapons officer on the anvil of reason, because that was what she was, and that was what she wanted to be. But some things changed. Commander Hale recommended her for early promotion, and the recommendation was approved before the ink was dry, and Sina found herself a full lieutenant with a gunnery command of her own, teaching the next generation of human gunners the shot she had invented in 9 minutes with a war on the line. She called it the needle, because that was what it was, and she taught it the way she had built it, as music, as shape, as the holding of 300 separate notes in one mind until they fell into place. Her students were young, most of them, younger even than she had been at Meridian, and she watched them learn to hold the shape, and she understood at last why Admiral Cashin had trusted her with the fleet. It was not that the young were reckless. It was that the young had not yet learned which impossible things were impossible. They simply did the math, and the math did not miss. Ensign Paul made lieutenant within the year, and became one of Sina's finest students, and he told anyone who would listen about the 29 minutes he had watched a young woman compose the end of an empire in total silence. Quaim Assant retired 2 years later with a chest full of commendations he claimed to find embarrassing, and spent his retirement telling the story badly and often in every port bar in the human sphere, and every version of it was a lie except the parts about Sina, which were all true. Commander Hale made captain, then commodore, and never again in her career trusted a fleet's fire to a gunner without first reading their file to see if they had the one thing she had seen in Sina Akoro at Meridian. Not the scores, not the raw skill, but the judgment to look at a 99% shot and build a second shot to close the 1%, because some things are worth more than the odds. And once, years later, when Sina was a commander herself, she was invited to speak at the Galactic Academy, at the gunnery track where she had spent 10,000 hours preparing for a shot no one had yet named. The hall was full of cadets, young and sharp and hungry, and they wanted her to tell them about the war moon, about the 29 minutes, about the moment the galaxy changed. Instead, she told them about the fence. "Everyone wants to hear about the needle," she said, standing at a plain podium in a plain uniform, older now but not old, never old, because the story locked her forever at the age she had been when she fired it. The threaded shot, 300 rails through a moving sphere, and it was a good shot, but it's not the shot I want you to remember. She looked out at the young faces. The shot I want you to remember is the 4 rails I took off the target, the fence. Because the needle was gunnery, and any of you will learn to do gunnery. The fence was the harder thing. The fence was looking at a 1% chance of killing an innocent, when every doctrine in the galaxy said take the odds and fire, and deciding that a 1% chance was 1% too many. The fence was the reason the Concordance remembers us as the species that spared the witness, instead of the species that murdered it to win. She paused. The Vrahel thought war was about how hard you could hit. They were wrong. War is about what you refuse to hit, even when hitting it would win. That's the thing they never understood about us. That's the thing I hope you never forget. She told them, too, the part of Meridian that no record held, because no sensor could capture it. She told them about the silence in the fire control ring in the 4 seconds before impact, the way the whole crew had gone still, not with fear, but with the particular stillness of people watching a thing they could no longer change. She told them that a railgun war teaches a lesson no other kind of war can teach, and the lesson is humility. A beam gunner believes to the last instant that the shot is theirs, that they can chase it, correct it, force it home. A railgun gunner learns early that the shot stops being theirs the moment it leaves the rail. After that, it belongs to the arithmetic, and to the universe, and all a gunner can do is have been right. We spend 10,000 hours learning to aim, she told the cadets, so that in the one instant that matters we can let go and trust that we already did the hard part. That's the discipline, not the firing, the letting go. Anyone can pull a trigger. It takes a lifetime to earn the right to stop touching the shot and simply believe in it. A cadet in the front row, young and grave, raised a hand. Commander, the Vrahel said we'd never been tested, that we'd never bled against a real fire. Were they right? Before Meridian, I mean, had we? Sina Akoro thought about it, the way she had thought about the Admiral's question years before, the last thing that wasn't in her file. No, she said, they were right, we hadn't. 100 years in the Concordance, and we'd never once had to prove what we were. She smiled, faintly, and it was not a warm smile, but it was not a cold one either. That was their mistake. Not that they declared war on a species that had been tested and found strong. That they declared war on a species that hadn't been tested at all, and they assumed that meant we were weak, when it only meant we were unknown. They looked at 100 years of our politeness and decided it was fear. They never once considered that it might be patience. She straightened. We were polite for 100 years because we were building something. We were building the answer. And when they finally asked the question, when they finally declared their war of correction and demanded to know what we were, we answered them the only way that couldn't be argued with. She looked out at the young gunners, the next generation of the human answer, and she gave them the last of it, the thing her own instructor had given her, the thing that had traveled from one young mind to the next across the whole strange history of what humanity had built. We answered with mass. Exactly where it needed to be, undiminished by distance, unweakened by the dark, because a beam is a threat, and the galaxy had spent 11,000 years learning to live with threats. Her voice dropped, quiet and certain and final. But a slug is a promise. And we always keep our promises. The hall was silent. Then, one by one, the cadets rose, and they did not cheer, because you did not cheer for the thing Sina Akoro had described. They simply stood, the way a fleet stands to attention when the flag passes, the way the galaxy had learned to stand when it spoke of the day humanity was tested at last and answered with railgun fire. Somewhere in the outer arm of the Concordance, in the Leviathan bone chamber, where a high reader had once declared a war he was certain he would win, the Vrahel no longer read declarations aloud. They had learned, as the whole galaxy had learned, the one lesson humanity had come to teach, that there are species you do not measure by their loudness, or their size, or the count of their guns, and that the most dangerous thing in the dark is not the enemy who threatens you with fire you can see. It is the quiet young gunner, 4 million kilometers away, in a dark you cannot see into, patiently doing the math, and the promise already fired, already true, already crossing the void toward you, that you will not even know has been made until the instant it arrives undiminished and keeps itself. They had declared war on humanity and expected a rout. Earth answered with railgun fire. And the galaxy at last remembered.